And on behalf of the Holocaust Memorial Resource and Education Center, I just want to send a big welcome to everyone that's joining us from all around the world, actually. And although our doors may be closed now, we are very happy to invite you all the next time you're in Central Florida. Hopefully our museum doors will be wide open again, and we hope you can visit us in person. Until then, though, we will make sure that all of our programming is still accessible to everyone. And so today actually marks the third in our series of strategies for action. Today is The Limits and Necessities of Never Again, the Holocaust and Injustice Today. And programs like these would not be possible at all if it weren't for really generous philanthropic support. And so I want to send a big thank you out to our sponsors of today's program, Matt and Shane Brofman and Andrew Snyder. In addition, United Arts, our friends at United Arts really believe in and support the work that we do. And so from now until September 15th, they are running a campaign with us to match all donations to the Holocaust Center at 15% of those donations. And so a really cool thing, we'll put it in the chat box, but if you just text the letters SFA for Strategies for Action to the number 91999, all of those donations will be matched at 15%. And so please, we will put that in the chat box, and I'll also let you know at the end about it. But we really believe in being able to provide these kinds of workshops and events completely free and open to the general public. And so this is what helps us to keep these conversations for change going. So without further ado, I'm very excited to introduce this workshop, The Limits and Necessities of Never Again, the Holocaust and Injustice Today. Please note that we will be concluding on time. We want to respect everyone's time and be concluding at 1 o'clock, but our facilitators are absolutely amazing, and they have agreed to actually stay on afterwards to extend the conversation and keep questions and Q&A going. So Dr. Danny M. Cohen is a Holocaust scholar, as well as a professor at Northwestern University and the founder of Unsilence. Sammy Oberman is an Unsilence facilitator, education designer, and a special education teacher in Chicago. Okay. Please help me in welcoming our wonderful facilitators from Unsilence.
Hi, everyone. We're so excited to be with you today. I'm just going to spend the next minute just making sure we're all comfortable using Zoom. So first, if you're comfortable turning on your camera, we love that. It makes it feel like we're all engaged. We're all in this together. We want to feel as connected to each other as possible. So obviously it's not okay for everyone, but if you are comfortable, we would appreciate putting cameras on. Second, you'll see at the bottom of your screen, there's a chat box. Make sure that is up and open, because there are multiple times that we're going to ask you to write things in that chat box to share your thoughts with the group and the community. Feel free to ask questions in there. I know a lot of these workshops just have a dedicated Q&A at the end. We want you to ask your questions throughout. So feel free to put questions in there. Give questions directly to me. I will be the one mostly looking at the chat. So if you message Danny directly, he might not see it, but if you message me, I'll be monitoring the chat throughout. Lastly, if you want to change your name, you can hover over your picture, and in the top right-hand corner, there will be 3 dots. You can click that and some options will come up. Rename is one of them. So feel free to put just your first name or your first and last, whatever you're comfortable doing. That's an opportunity for you to just write how you would like to be addressed. And if you are uncomfortable sharing with the entire group, but you would like your name to be, would like your thought to be shared in general, feel free to message me privately so I can share your thoughts anonymously with the group. So I am listed as Unsilence Sammy Oberman, so you can get to me really quickly that way. And have a great session. Feel free to ask questions throughout, unmute yourself, raise your hand with the reactions button on the bottom, anything to get our attention. Danny,
Okay.
want to take it?
Thank you, Sammy, and thank you to Serena and Rachel and Lisa and everyone at the center in Florida. I'm coming to you live from Chicago, a slightly different time zone, but it's really wonderful to be here. This is not my first. This is not our first session with the community, so we're just really excited to be back. So thank you for having us. We're going to really jump in. If you've participated in one of our workshops before, you know this is pretty hands-on, so we're not going to let you get away with just sitting back and listening. We want to hear your ideas, and we want to have a conversation today. And so we have a question for you. We're going to jump right in, and we're going to ask you to go into the chat, and as Sammy just said, if you're comfortable responding in the chat, if you're not comfortable sharing your thoughts with everyone, you can message Sammy directly in the chat. Just go to Unsilence Sammy Oberman. Here's a question for you, just to sort of get us to really dive in here. When you hear someone using the Holocaust to talk about what's happening in the world today, how do you feel? What's your gut reaction? So when you hear someone using the Holocaust to talk about what's happening in the world today, how do you feel? What's your gut reaction? Jump into the chat, share your thoughts. We're going to get started.
So it depends on the situation. It undermines. Sometimes you feel it's appropriate. Sometimes you're troubled because they're not equivalent. Nothing can compare to the Holocaust, but there are some frightening parallels. People are feeling angry and sad. We should be knowing better by now. Some more scared and sad. Some more it depends on who is using it, how they're using it. Doesn't feel appropriate. More feelings of sadness and that similarities can even come up. Fear that it can happen again. Fear and parallels and past atrocities, and feeling that, again, these things are not equivalent. They're usually exaggerating. So we're thinking about it can depend on the situation, but they're usually exaggerating, or it's not even close. But there are parallels. They're systemic in both ways. State-sponsored. The Holocaust, in some cases, is the same for Black people. Depends on the context. Some people don't feel like they have that strong of a reaction. What we are experiencing is not the same. Depends on how it's compared. So there's still a lot of will we ever learn from these similarities? People are agreeing. People are feeling annoyed. Thank you.
I think it's fascinating to see that already, just by asking this question, we already have a little bit of disagreement in our community right now, where some people are saying nothing can compare to the Holocaust. And some people are pointing out that, well, sometimes there are things that can compare. There's a lot of different emotional reactions like anger and sadness. Maybe sadness that, if I'm thinking about my own response, if I see a comparison between the Holocaust and an ongoing atrocity or genocide today, it makes me sad that we haven't learned as an international community. We're not upholding the promises that we made after the Holocaust to prevent genocide. What we're going to be doing today, we're going to come back to this question a little later. What we're going to be doing today is we're going to be exploring a testimony from the child of a Jewish Holocaust survivor. And we're going to be using that testimony as an entry point, as a way to talk about analogies between the Holocaust and other events in history and today. So that's what we're going to be doing. As I said earlier, this is going to be interactive. Please ask questions as we go along. Please share your thoughts. As you've just seen, we're going to be reading out many of your comments, so it feels like a dialogue, even though much of your responses will be written. I think we're ready to jump in. So what I'd like to introduce you to, and we're going to get sort of like a little snippet of his story. I'd like to introduce you to a really important person called Michael Bauer. Michael Bauer was the son of two Jewish Holocaust survivors. He was a well-known Chicago civil rights and human rights activist. I was honored to call him a friend of mine and a colleague of mine. He was the co-chair of the Illinois Holocaust and Genocide Commission, and he was also very involved in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. I met him a number of years ago, and he told me his story and his parents' story, and I worked with him to turn his testimony, his experience as the son of two Jewish Holocaust survivors, into what you'll see as an interactive testimony, an interactive educational feature on the Violence website. What is really important about Michael, who, by the way, he passed away just last year, quite suddenly. He was pretty young, and so we've lost a really important activist in our community, but his story lives on through his testimony that is called The Son. And what makes his testimony so unique and powerful and important, as you'll see, is that he was gay, and he connected his own experiences as a gay man in the United States, particularly in the 1980s, during the AIDS crisis under the Reagan administration. And he talks about coming out as gay to his parents, both of whom are Jewish Holocaust survivors. So what we're going to do is we're going to jump into his testimony kind of halfway through, and Sammy's going to do a read aloud, and we're going to discuss a couple of parts of his testimony as a way to talk about analogies between the Holocaust and ongoing human rights violations and atrocities today.
The kitchen table. For my birthday, I wanted my father's ring. Oh, goodness. I also wanted my mother to sit down to a videotaping of her life history as a Jewish Holocaust survivor. She agreed reluctantly. The taping was on the afternoon of my birthday, and we went out to dinner. A year later, I delivered a copy of my mother's video to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum on the day the museum first opened. Days earlier, I'd attended a march on Washington for gay rights. I'd already come out as gay to my parents back in 1984. We were in their apartment at their kitchen table, and I said, I need to talk to you about something. I needed to tell them, but their reactions were very different.
Thank you, Sammy. So at this point in the testimony, we have a choice. Do we follow the path and listen to Michael's mother's reaction to him coming out as gay, or do we listen to his father's reaction as coming out as gay? Remember, both of them are Jewish Holocaust survivors. This is 1984. We're in the middle of the AIDS epidemic. Being gay is certainly stigmatized, as it is in some communities still in 2020, but it is quite a different time. And so something we do is we'll do a read aloud with young people, high school students, and we'll use Michael's testimony and we'll say, okay, well, now we're going to vote. Do you want to follow the pathway of Michael's mother, or should we follow the pathway of Michael's father? So we're going to do a little vote right now, and we're just going to ask you just to raise your hand on your screen. So please raise your hand if you'd like to follow the pathway of Michael's father. See lots of hands. Going to kind of eyeball it. And now raise your hand if you'd like to follow the pathway of Michael's mother.
Thank you to those raising your hands virtually. I see some participants clicking the raise hand feature too.
All right. So we're actually, I think it was pretty even, the vote. But we're going to follow what many young people do, which is, I think, really interesting, which is follow the mother response, Michael's mother. So let's do that first and see what happens.
My mother. My mother said to me, "I'm sorry you were ever born." She said it multiple times on different occasions. My mother, you have to understand something about the survivors, the people who went through the Nazi ghettos and the slave labor camps. They didn't know if they were going to survive. And once they survived, many were driven to build a life, to have children and grandchildren. Many of us children of survivors are named after our relatives who were murdered. I was coming out as gay, and I was taking something away from my mother, something incredibly meaningful.
We're going to keep reading. The next page is Avram.
Avram. One day in the Lotz ghetto, there was the deportation, and Avram, my mother's nephew, was gone. She couldn't protect him. When she told me that she wished I hadn't been born, she didn't mean it. I was gay. I wasn't giving her grandchildren. I was taking away her reason for survival. I remember as a kid, my responsibility was to bring only happiness to my parents. This was a horrible pressure. There's a subset of us children, gay and lesbian children of Holocaust survivors. The pressure to give them grandchildren, to give them no trouble. Our parents were so traumatized.
Thank you, Sammy. I want us just to have the opportunity just to reflect on this part of Michael's story. So what's just happened, Michael has told his parents that he is gay. It's 1984. Both of his parents are Jewish Holocaust survivors. And his mother's response is, "I wish you were never born." How do we respond to that? Please jump into the chat and just share your reaction to this part of Michael's story. Any questions you might have, any gut reactions that you have.
People are feeling that it must have been heartbreaking, devastating, so hurtful. It hurts my heart. So sad, devastating. That would crush one as a child. That would have crushed me. Glad he realized she didn't mean it in that way. At first, maybe you think it's a hurtful thing to say. It's terrible. You don't think a parent should ever say such a thing. That's not unconditional love. It's a really interesting word you'll see later. Totally destroyed. Someone has seen that happen to gay people who've married and have children because they did not want to disappoint their parents. No children to be told by a parent that they regret their birth. That's trauma. That's a reactive, traumatizing response. It's amazing that Michael was able to understand why she said it, but it certainly wouldn't take away the pain of it. So both can be true. It's hard to see how that trauma affects children. Again, people are amazed of Michael's resilience in the face of everything and how it can be hurtful and still possible to see his mother's love for him. Some people just feel confused, like how can that be the response? It's really tough. Really tough to be second generation too and be raised by Holocaust survivors.
Thank you. So feel free, we're going to keep moving. Feel free to just add your comments as we go along. I think what is really striking when we take this story into high school classrooms, sometimes over Zoom or in person when we're able to, we get a lot of some similar reactions. At first, young people will be kind of like outraged and pissed that like, how can a parent say that? But Michael walks us through exactly why he sees his mother's response not as justified, but as people wrote, sort of understanding her response. He has empathy. He really sort of gets where she's coming from, and he kind of lets her off the hook in a sense.
I see a couple hands being raised virtually. Are those people trying to ask a question? I see JTS, Elena, and Lynn. Okay, no worries. Danny, then continue. I'll lower the hand.
Let's jump back into the story and follow the next pathway where we see Michael's father's response and how that might be different to his mother's response.
My father. I still remember my father saying this. The first thing he said was, "You have to be very careful because people like you had it worst of all in the camps." He was talking about the homosexual prisoners. I'd known about the Nazis' gay victims, but I never really thought about it until then. I took my father's response as very loving and protective. My father had an amazing gift, especially in light of what he went through. He was able to love unconditionally.
Thank you. So what's happening here, we're going to try and move quickly, but feel free to just sort of write down your response to Michael's father's reaction to Michael coming out as gay. And remember, both his mother and father are Jewish Holocaust survivors, both from the Łódź ghetto. Both were sent to Nazi camps. Both survived.
Father's reaction was very supportive. Some people feel it's the opposite of what they expected. They expected the mother figure to feel that way. His father seemed to respond from a place of understanding, empathy, protection. And the reactions were coming from fear, which is often the case.
Thank you. Let's move on. We're going to read another part of Michael's story where he reflects on the assassination of Harvey Milk.
The assassination. One event that propelled me to come out as gay was the assassination of Harvey Milk. I remember thinking, they're killing people like me. The AIDS crisis got me into politics. An article, it was called Grid back then, appeared in the New York Times 2 months after Roger and I got together. Had we not met when we did, I doubt either of us would have survived. We were in our late 20s, we were party boys, and if we weren't together, it could have been us. I remember the first funeral, our friend David Evans, and all of a sudden, our friends were dying left and right. And there's not a month that went by when we weren't going to a funeral or memorial service. That's how I got into politics. We needed the government to help us. There's an overlap between being the son of Holocaust survivors and being gay and living through the AIDS crisis. Our friends were dying at a relatively young age. I'd become like my parents. Most of my friends are just memories. There's a conclusion I've drawn. This is what happens to people when they lack political power. I was aware of the Reagan administration's lack of response to AIDS. If we weren't going to fight for our rights, then who would?
Thank you, Sammy. Again, let's respond. Jump into the chat. What is your response to what Michael is telling us, and also the way he's framing his own story? What's your response?
Powerful. It sounds so current. related to Black Lives Matter now. First of all, it is a fight for his own survival. It's really powerful. We have empowerment, this need to make a difference. People need to step up, whether or not they're personally affected. Interesting, framing his loss of friends at a young age to his parents' losses. This is what happens to people that don't have political power. That's profound. Willing to take on the government. Politics is more than voting. It's daily involvement. It's standing up for what's right. People acknowledging that you need to stand up for people who lack power. Thank you everyone for sharing.
I think what's really quite amazing in this moment in Michael's testimony is, and we saw this at the very beginning, right, of our conversation today, when we hear others make connections between the Holocaust and ongoing events, many of us, myself included, we're sometimes sort of angry and outraged, and we can often feel, hey, you can't make that connection, you can't make that comparison. What's powerful here, I think, is that Michael, who is the son of two Jewish Holocaust survivors, he is, in his words, I'd become like my parents. Most of my friends around me were dying, right? He sees his own story almost as a repetition or as a mirror, a reflection of his parents' experience. It may be a reflection of Michael's sort of like inherited trauma. We in the Holocaust world, we often talk about, Holocaust education world, we often talk about inherited trauma that is sort of passed from generation to generation. We might be seeing that here, but we're also seeing Michael try to make sense of his own story through his parents' story, right? And in a sense, and feel free to write in the chat if you disagree, I think it's really hard to push back at Michael. I kind of feel like, well, that's up to you. You're allowed to make that comparison. What do people think here? Does Michael have permission, or more permission than others to make this comparison? Or do we still feel uncomfortable with him drawing an analogy between the Holocaust and the AIDS epidemic in the United States under Reagan in the 1980s?
I do want to highlight one thing Leslie said of there's a difference in her mind between connection and comparison, and his testimony is a beautiful example of that. So he is building these connections. People are saying it's ultimately about loss. Also earlier up, Jill had mentioned that during the AIDS crisis, gay people were being blamed for AIDS in the same way that people were blaming Jews for the Holocaust. He's relating without saying something like, this is like the Holocaust. You can hide gay. Holocaust, they came hunting for Jews. Absent political power, all oppressed people are hamstrung. Survivors and children of survivors have more license to make comparisons due to their unique perspectives. However, those perspectives can also take too personal to generalize.
I think it's
so
really...
Yeah.
Sorry, Sam.
No worries. We're just talking about how specific Michael is in connecting his identity to these various histories and these connecting histories.
Thank you. I'd like to, this idea of, someone wrote, you can hide gay, Holocaust, they came hunting for Jews. I remember having a conversation about that with Michael, actually, when we were sort of unpacking his story. And we noted that the Nazis also hunted homosexuals in Germany and Austria, right? They rounded up something like 100,000 they arrested around 100,000 homosexuals during the Nazi era, imprisoned about half of them. The numbers are a little fuzzy. And so this leads me to question, we know that the Nazis targeted Jews and homosexuals and people with disabilities and people of Roma descent, some people of African descent, and many other groups of people, Jehovah's Witnesses and others. Maybe, and this is more of a question than anything, maybe it's okay to draw analogies between the events under Nazism and the ongoing oppression of the same groups today? Or is it okay to expand our analogies and comparisons between the Holocaust and other ongoing atrocities? And this is where we're going to jump to another part of Michael's testimony titled Genocide, where Michael reflects on this very question. So let's jump back in right there.
Genocide. I am horrified that as much as we've adopted the phrase never again, modern society uses it as a term to apply in hindsight, hardly ever to apply to what's happening right now. The Carter administration aligned itself with Pol Pot, knowing he was killing Cambodians. The Clinton administration did nothing about the Tutsis being murdered in Rwanda. Right now, Syrians are being murdered by Assad, and the Obama administration doesn't act. I'm horrified that people aren't speaking out. Why don't people feel a commitment? When I see those Syrian refugees, I see my parents.
Let's jump back into the chat, and many of you are already doing it. What's your response to what Michael is saying, to what he's arguing?
So I want to highlight something that was said before as well, of Victoria mentioning that people think the Holocaust and they go straight to the genocide. Things happen gradually. Propaganda, them versus us mentality, laws being passed. People think his viewpoint is valid because it's about his experience. Michael was understanding that never again is still happening in bits and pieces, and it's still horrifying. It's like saying you can hide being a Jew because they are white. I totally disagree with the statement about hiding being LGBT. Also, this connection of the difference between gay men and lesbians and what was happening during the Holocaust at that time too. My friend died of AIDS in 1987, and I remember how difficult it was to get people to pay attention, as many felt that it was a disease limited to the gay community. When it started to spread more broadly, then resources and attention started to come to pass. If it affected others, it wasn't that relevant. However, it seems that. So people are starting of why do we not pay the same amount of attention when it's just to one group? Many Americans don't care about what's going on in the rest of the world because it doesn't feel that immediate. People are feeling that he's correct. We don't know why we don't act in real time. There are many genocides happening as we speak. Silence enables atrocities to happen no matter the time or the place. What he's saying is true. There are many things happening right now in the world, and international organizations are not paying as much attention as they should. More people are agreeing. There is or should be a solidarity among all vulnerable and persecuted people, and should be a solidarity among all of those who fight to defend them. How are we still allowing genocide to occur? We're being silent and condoning it. This is because that is humanity. This has not declared a right or wrong. We need to globally condemn these things and as a world respond. We still allow so much across the planet because we are afraid to set the boundaries, kind of like Star Trek Prime Directive, not to interfere. We have a poor treatment of at-risk populations in our own country. When will we deal with that? So a lot of connections that people are drawing, a lot of confusion. I'm hearing emotion in a lot of these responses. Um, yeah, Danny.
Thank you, Sammy. This is a really great, I think, segue into our next big question that we'd like to ask you. I'm going to ask you to continue to jump into the chat and write down what are some of the specific analogies that you have seen used, both ways you've seen or ways you've seen the Holocaust used when discussing other forms of injustice today. And we'd love for you to share analogies that you agree with and analogies that you disagree with. So what are some specific analogies that you've seen used or ways that you've seen the Holocaust used by other people in your community, across the country, around the world, either that you agree with or that you disagree with?
We're seeing some starting to come in. We're seeing abortion. We're seeing atrocities in China, children separated from their parents at the border, Pittsburgh, rise of anti-Semitism, dying rooms, detention centers at the border being compared to concentration camps specifically, federal agents picking up people on Portland without explanation or identification, ICE. Remember, these are connections that people have heard, have said themselves, may be okay with, maybe not okay with. So we're saying these without judgment, but rather just reflecting on things we've heard in society. Abortion, people use this as an excuse to ban abortion. Conservative government standing up against the KKK and not standing up against the KKK and other hate groups. Caging of children and adults compared to the Holocaust, but feeling that is not the same thing. Use of toxic cleaning chemicals in detention camps. Detention centers at the border again. Overall political climate, treatment of Black Americans, the attack on the free press and the spread of lies by the far right, suppression of the press or attempts to discredit the press reporting the facts, demonizing immigrants. Affirmative action sometimes is brought up in this conversation related to the Holocaust. Is power. Yes, thanks, Danny.
I'm going to add, just as I'm reading through this list, I'm sort of reminded of some other examples. Someone mentioned the use of the term concentration camps when talking about the ICE detention facilities under the Trump-Pence administration. And I'm reminded of the debate last summer when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez very intentionally used the term concentration camps, and it led to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum explicitly speaking out and saying that we can never draw analogies between the Holocaust and today. And in response, literally hundreds of Holocaust historians and Holocaust scholars, almost all of my colleagues and myself included, we wrote a public letter. We signed onto a public letter telling the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, no, we need to draw connections and make comparisons between history and today. Why are we doing this? Why do we study this? Why do we teach this if that's not the goal? Obviously, one goal of Holocaust education is to keep the memory alive and just to remember what happened and to honor all of those millions who were murdered by the Nazis. But at the same time, we also want to hold on to lessons, and we want to identify lessons. I made the argument specifically with my students, with my colleagues, about Ocasio-Cortez and her comments about concentration camps, the Nazis didn't invent concentration camps. Who invented concentration camps? The British. As you might be able to hear, I am British. I'm from London originally. Concentration camps were used in the late 19th century. They were used throughout the 20th century. The United States themselves have called the Chinese incarceration of the Uyghurs in China today, where there are more than 1 million Muslim Chinese in camps right now. The United States has officially called them concentration camps. And so Ocasio-Cortez calling the detention centers run by ICE, where children have been separated from their families, which goes against international law, goes against children's rights law. Many of us who study the history of concentration camps agree, yeah, they are concentration camps. But what's, I think, fascinating is our emotional response to these analogies. Why is it that we feel so outraged? Why is it that we feel so angry? And why do we react so strongly when there is an analogy that's drawn that we disagree with? And so I'd like to sort of like build on this question, which calls back to the question we asked at the beginning. How do we feel when we see, I'll be specific, what are the specific emotions that we experience when we hear these analogies, whether it's our neighbors or family members or politicians or community leaders? How do we feel? What are the emotional responses that we feel? Let's really unpack that here.
Fear, anxiety, outrage, re-traumatization, and pain. I think trauma is very important to remember about that fear, more fear. Some people are saying that some of those emotions may spring from how the Holocaust is taught or not taught. So it's linked to other atrocities. Feeling different depending on who's saying it. So it's different if they're Jewish or not. It can be frightening. Allies of the persecuted groups have to be prepared to risk their comfort at the least, and in some circumstances, their resources and even their lives, and sharing personal stories on how their family members did this. Some people are feeling guilt that they haven't done enough, so anger, frustration. Alert, call to action. Yeah.
I like that, alert and a call to action. Does anyone experience any positive emotions? We have lots of negative emotions, which are all valid, and I certainly feel frustration and anger and outrage. Has anyone felt a sense of relief or a sense of hopefulness that people are making connections between history and today? I'll speak for myself. I've now and then, even if I don't quite agree with an analogy, as a Holocaust scholar, I kind of feel heartened that the Holocaust is so often in the news. It's kind of amazing, really, if you think about it, right? We talk about never forget, never forget, never forget. And even though the Holocaust is so often abused or misused or misunderstood or taken out of context, I think we have to kind of stop for a moment and maybe see a silver lining that we have something really incredible happening in our political discourse, where the Holocaust feels like it has somewhat of a permanent place, I think. Yes, we have to push back and keep providing context and correcting people and making sure that the conversation is accurate. and the history is being presented in an accurate way. But there's something in me that feels optimistic that many people keep the Holocaust or the memory of the Holocaust alive by making these connections. And I wonder how we can leverage that in a really positive, inspiring way.
And I'm seeing a lot of people agree with Danny. Some people are digging into the nuance a bit of, we're okay with these connections. We, as historians, we believe in these connections, but comparisons are too far. Some people are saying comparisons and connection is what we should be doing right now. Some people are saying that it's using the Holocaust is really strong and you better be accurate about it because you can use it to get attention and that can be really harmful. So some people are proud that these connections are being made and that the Holocaust is remaining relevant. I believe it was Isabella up earlier that said, as long as we keep connecting the Holocaust to what is happening in the world, we won't forget it and it will be used to help learn and push our society forward. So we're seeing a lot of different nuances to people's feelings.
I want to jump in and share a very specific example that if I'm remembering correctly, actually has a Florida connection. It was a couple of years ago, and I'm totally forgetting which Florida-based elected official made this argument, but it was an argument about access to guns and gun rights. And feel free, if you know what I'm talking about, to throw the name of the elected official into the chat. A gentleman made the argument that everyone in the United States needs to have access to guns because look what happened in the Holocaust. That if all of the Jews in Europe had guns in their homes, then the Nazis wouldn't have been able to deport them. My reaction to that when I heard that, this was in 2018, so 2 years ago, when I first heard that, my first reaction was, I was a little bit outraged. I was a little bit sort of like scratching my head thinking, hold on a second, there was lots of armed resistance during the Holocaust. We can point to the partisans in the forests all throughout Europe. We can point to Mordechai Analevich and the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising that was armed resistance. We can point to the United States and Britain and the Soviet Union and their enormous armies fighting the Nazis and struggling. And so in the context of the history, we know that there was plenty of armed resistance against the Nazis, yet the Nazis were still able to murder everyone in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And at the same time, there was some armed resistance that was successful, but at the end of the day, the Nazi machinery and the gas chambers and the ovens continued. And so I remember going through a series of emotions of sort of like frustration and outrage that this was being taken out of context, and there was almost some sort of victim blaming, like if the Jews hadn't have fought back harder, this wouldn't have happened. But at the same time, as I said earlier, I was excited that we were having this conversation and excited that my colleagues and I had an opportunity to engage communities and our students in these conversations, because these politicians, these community leaders were kind of keeping the history alive and giving us something to grab onto and allowing us to have some really wonderful conversations and put some educational programs in place in response. I think that this is, and we're sort of like, we're coming to the end of our workshop today. I think this leads to a really important question, which is, this is really messy, right? drawing analogies can sometimes lead to us staying silent because we just don't know what to say. And so we have to ask, how do we navigate this? When are we okay with people making comparisons and connections to the Holocaust? And when are we not okay with people making comparisons or making connections? And are there any rules that we should follow? What should we do? Are there any guidelines that we can put in place for ourselves as we navigate coming up against people who are making connections, and even put some rules in place for ourselves about whether or not we allow ourselves to make connections and comparisons? Please jump into the chat. What do you think those rules should be? When is it okay or not okay to make comparisons and connections? How do we navigate this?
And as you guys are putting those in the chat, I want to also highlight something David said earlier of what if it wasn't about comparison and more about integration? These chapters of history are not 100% distinct. They inform each other. Examples, Hitler's inspiration from Jim Crow America. So that is something that was mentioned earlier. That again, we're seeing people need to have a strong base in actual history before they start making connections and comparisons. From what I'm hearing, it seems okay if we are speaking about specific components and issues, but maybe not the Holocaust as a whole. And some people are still traumatized from when talks go from a central shul in Central Florida. And sometimes you don't want to have those conversations based on how things have gone wrong. A reminder that Jews did fight back. Hitler confiscated weapons. There's this kind of illusion that Jews didn't. And again, we're talking about grounding things in actual history. People are mentioning as a non-Jew, the comparison is never made to offend Jews, but rather to show comparisons and show warnings, not to allow history to repeat itself and stop before we get to the point where other people had said, never again has a purpose. And we need to be thinking about what those purposes are, maintaining historical perspective in the comparisons. When history is misspoken, be mindful and restate it correctly as the comparisons are attested to be expressed. So I'm hearing a lot of themes here about historical accuracy, about specificity rather than the Holocaust as a whole, and also intention of why is this being made? Why is this connection being made? Is it to further a purpose, or is it to gain some sort of attention or embellishment?
I really love this comment, where was it now? From David Estrian about what if it isn't about comparison? What if it's about integration? I think that's key. I think that I think we've made a mistake in the way we remember the Holocaust. I think what we do too often is I think that we have put the Holocaust in its own little bubble, as if it just happened in its own little space and time. And the reality is that the Nazis took their ideology and their eugenics policy, they took it from British so-called scientists and American so-called scientists who were already for years forcibly sterilizing people of color and people with disabilities. And the Nazis said, oh, look, the Brits and the Americans, they know what they're doing. They are perfecting and trying to purify their own nations. And the Nazis took it to even more extremes. And they started to forcibly sterilize people of Jewish descent, people of Roma descent, forcibly sterilizing people of African descent in the 1930s, forcibly sterilizing people with disabilities. That led to murder, that led to intentional starvation, and so on. But when Nazism was defeated in 1945, the eugenics movement didn't end. I don't know how many of you know, when did forcible sterilizations end in the United States? Anybody know? Give folks a chance to just type in the chat. Elena wrote 1970s. It was 1974 where US governments were still sterilizing specifically Native American women. In 1974, right? We have the Canadian government forcibly sterilizing Native Canadians, Indigenous people in the 21st century. And we have the Chinese government today forcibly sterilizing the Muslim minorities in their camps. This idea of forcible sterilization it falls under the definition of genocide under international law. Genocide isn't just mass murder. And so, as I was saying, we've made the mistake of teaching the Holocaust and remembering the Holocaust in this bubble. But really, what is the Holocaust? The Holocaust is sort of one of the peaks of the history of white supremacy, right? And so when we remember the Holocaust, we have to teach the Holocaust as being part of the history of white supremacy, where Nazism was inspired by white supremacists, and Nazism still is part of ideologies around the world. And when we see people make connections and comparisons, I think we can use that context as a way to gauge whether or not the connection or comparison should be permitted, right? I also think that, as people have said, we need to really make sure that we're being historically accurate as well. And I think we need to remind ourselves or ask ourselves, what are the goals of Holocaust education? And do the comparisons and connections that people are making, are they serving the goals of Holocaust education? And if so, then perhaps we can allow particular comparisons and connections to be made. This was a really quick session. I feel like we could go on for a whole other hour. So we're going to stop there. Sammy and I are going to hang around to answer any questions. But we really want to thank you for being part of this today. Thank you for giving us an hour. Thank you for being with us. Thank you again to the center, to Lisa and Serena, and to Rachel for bringing us in. We absolutely loved this conversation that we had today. Thank you so very much. You can find more about our work at www.unsilenced.org. And I'm going to hand it over to Rachel and Serena just to do a very quick wrap up.
Thank you, Dr. Cohen. Yes, actually, as we were planning for this session, we knew right up front that this was obviously going to take more than an hour, but we wanted to respect your time. And so we are going to have a official close, but many of us are going to be staying afterwards to continue this dialogue and to be able to ask questions directly to Dr. Cohen and to Sammy. But definitely wanted to thank you all for coming. And also, you know, Dr. Cohen and Sammy and the entire Unsilence organization has been such amazing partners in this work. And we're actually going to be continuing that partnership also with doing kind of afternoon with the author, where we can read Dr. Cohen's book, Train, and doing some more work as we are continuing our strategies for action and talking about the Holocaust, but also making sure that we are really really analyzing and putting into action what never again really means. So thank you all. As you all know, you'll be receiving an email today or tomorrow that will have a feedback survey. Please, it'll only take just a moment. We really appreciate your feedback. There'll also be information in that email about our upcoming sessions. The next one is actually on August 7th, entitled Color Coded: Language as a Survival Tool. So we hope you are able to join us for that. But again, programs like these, we really rely on the generous support of the community. And so a special thanks again go to Matt and Shane Brothman, as well as Andrew Snyder, for sponsoring this particular session and event. This work is so important, and it's very meaningful for us and important that we keep it free and open to the community. So if you're able to donate as well, please keep in mind that United Arts is having that 15% match on all donations to the Holocaust Center through September 15th. And all you need to do is text the letters SFA, so it's Strategies for Action, to 91999, and you'll receive a link with instructions on how to donate. So thank you again for everyone for coming. And I'm going to actually turn it back over to Dr. Cohen and to Sammy so they can continue with the discussion and the Q&A.
Great. So I've recorded a couple of the questions that were asked in the chat. So we'll start there, but then after that, feel free to add more questions or write them in the chat, unmute in the chat or ask them. So we're going to start with Danny. Do you have any books or recommendations for general trauma of grandchildren of Holocaust survivors or other family members of Holocaust survivors?
Yes. Hold on. I have lots. You can see me organizing my books and they're about to fall off my shelf. Okay, I have a couple. So I imagine many of you know Mouse by Art Spiegelman, which is an incredible reflection through a graphic novel and won the Pulitzer Prize about Art's conversations with his father, and it really addresses intergenerational trauma and inherited trauma in a really powerful way. We also have a book called In the Shadows of Memory, and this is about the Holocaust in the third generation. I actually have a story in here. It's fiction. I'm a fiction writer, and I'm the grandson of a Holocaust survivor, and so I struggle to. I'll be honest. I think I have experienced intergenerational trauma myself. I often found it very difficult to talk about my own family history, and I use fiction as a vehicle to help me process my own sort of thoughts and feelings and emotions about my family history. So In the Shadows of Memory, the Holocaust in the Third Generation. There's quite a lot out there as it relates to the children and grandchildren of survivors. Here's one more, or two more actually, that I recommend. It's a novel, Secondhand Smoke, by Thane Rosenbaum. The title, this idea of the smoke being a reference to the chimneys, but it's secondhand, being the second generation. And then another graphic novel, I Was a Child of Holocaust Survivors, by Bernice Eisenstein. I recommend it.
Great, thank you. I recorded those and I'll put the links in the chat in a moment. The second question is, how do we talk to our friends who are posting memes comparing monuments being taken down with the Holocaust?
Yeah, this is a point that I was going to make earlier. We just ran out of time. I think we have to remember that when people make these comparisons, it's often coming from a place of outrage and anger and frustration. And people, I think, reach for the Holocaust because they think, and we all do this, right? We think that it's going to add weight to our argument. But I think we have to sort of set aside our own anger for a moment and realize that the person on the other side is also really angry or really outraged or concerned. We might agree with their outrage because maybe they're really outraged about a human rights violation or ongoing genocide or something they see might lead to genocide or atrocity. And so I think we have to remind ourselves, first of all, that they are feeling like they're feeling very strong emotions, and maybe we need to understand that and help them through it or listen a little more. Easier said than done, right? But I think we also have to remember that many people are using these analogies because political leaders are very intentional, I think, about riling up, so getting their base really overexcited, and they'll intentionally use the Holocaust as a way to get people really riled up. And so sometimes our anger is kind of misdirected. Sometimes maybe we shouldn't be so angry with our neighbor or our cousin for making these connections. Where are they getting these connections from? They're often getting them from people who are intentionally manipulating their base. And so I think just reminding ourselves that we sometimes take our frustration out on the wrong people is something is kind of our first step towards real dialogue. I don't know if that answered the question fully, but that's the first step.
Thank you. And then, do you believe that if we reach young people when impressions are being formed is helpful?
Yes, I do. I really do. I mean, that's why my work for the last 20 years is all focused on designing learning experiences for young people, training middle school teachers and high school teachers. Programs like this for the public, for adults, are also really important in shifting our conversations and our culture. But it sounds like a cliche, but like young people are the future. Young people, in part because we know that young people are so impressionable. We know from an adolescent development perspective that when we get young people to have particular conversations and to explore particular concepts, we know that those concepts are going to stick with them for the rest of their lives and they're going to inform their identities. And so I think we do need to really put a lot of our energy and resources, including our money, into really excellent education, and that includes human rights education, Holocaust education, social justice education, anti-genocide education, and so on. That has to be a priority for us, not only as a community, but as a society. If we're not doing that, then we're really failing ourselves.
Thank you. Does anyone have any questions that they would like to drop in the chat or unmute themselves and ask?
Okay.
Okay, great. So all the books that Danny shared are in the chat. I put links to Amazon. I know it's simple, but if you have another way of getting these books at independent bookstores, I would highly encourage you all to do that. I also want to give a plug for Dr. Danny M. Cohen's book, Train. He's not one to do that for himself, but he writes Holocaust fiction that got me very involved in this work. He is doing, I know Serena is doing a book club on it, and he'll be doing a Q&A with the author. So definitely add that. And okay, so Kimberly's question was for very young children. We'll put different books on that. Train is for teenagers around. But
there's a whole argument in the Holocaust education field that books about the Holocaust for very young children may be may not be appropriate. There's a whole literature and whole debate on that, but I imagine that Rachel and Serena and Lisa can point you in the direction of talking, of sort of like figuring out what texts may or may not be appropriate. But that's a whole other conversation that we could have another time. Well, thank you very much again. And for those who will be coming along to the club session, I'm really looking forward to seeing you again.
Thank you all. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you. Danny, are there any young books, books for young children that you wanted to highlight?
There are no, if I'm honest, I'm pretty conservative. So in this, not politically, but I'm pretty conservative in that I don't think that children below middle school should be learning about the Holocaust. I think, as Jill said, Elie Wiesel said to read books to very young children about being nice to one another, even when you're different. I think that's what young children should be learning about. They don't need to be learning Holocaust history yet. I think it can be traumatizing and can cause more harm than good.
And Dr. Cohn, I was going to add that I didn't see who the comment came from. We'll keep track of it, though. We have a transcript of it. But if anyone wants to email me directly at the Holocaust Center, my name is Rachel Lucy Hitt, and I can put my email in there. We do a lot of work when we're talking about early learners in really doing compassion building, right? And respect and diversity and inclusion, and using that as like a foundation so that when students get into their middle school years, that they have a stronger foundation to be able to accept the information and to process it in a stronger way. And I do feel that is oftentimes a better way to build and build on that subject, as opposed to going directly into Holocaust education. But there is debate about it, and I can let you know all the different perspectives on that. So please feel free. Thank you, Lisa, for putting my email in the chat. You can contact me directly, and I'm happy to have a conversation with you.
You got it, baby?
Well, thank you all. Have a wonderful afternoon. Bye.
Hi, everybody.